On the night of June 21, 1941, the largest invasion force in human history waited in darkness along a 2,900-kilometer front. By 1941, Nazi Germany controlled most of Europe, but Adolf Hitler's true ambition had always pointed east. In August 1939, Germany and the Soviet Union signed a non-aggression pact, both sides knowing it was a temporary lie. The plan called for 3 simultaneous army groups to destroy the Red Army in a single summer campaign, 8 weeks maximum. 3 million German and Axis soldiers, the most powerful military force ever assembled, prepared to cross the Soviet border. Army Group North drove for Leningrad. Army Group Center aimed at Moscow. Army Group South targeted Ukraine's resources. The Soviet military was deployed forward, densely packed near the border, positioned for attack, not defense, and totally exposed. Stalin received over 80 separate warnings of the coming invasion and dismissed every one as a provocation or deception. Soviet border guards stood their posts through the night of June 21st, unaware that history was waiting in the darkness beyond them. At 3:15 a.m. on June 22, 1941, thousands of guns opened fire simultaneously, and the world changed forever. German armored spearheads crossed the border before dawn, moving faster than the Soviet command could comprehend or respond. Within hours, over 1,200 Soviet aircraft were destroyed on the ground, the Soviet air force crippled before it could respond. In the Kremlin, Stalin received the reports in silence, and for critical hours, could not give his generals clear orders. Soviet border units were shattered before they could organize, their communications cut, their headquarters destroyed, their officers in shock. German panzer groups raced east at unprecedented speed, bypassing Soviet units, cutting supply lines, creating chaos faster than orders could follow. The Luftwaffe controlled the skies completely. Soviet columns moving in daylight were bombed at will without opposition. In the first week alone, over 400,000 Soviet soldiers were captured, entire armies dissolving before the German advance. German infantry moved through destroyed Soviet positions, the advance moving so fast that soldiers could barely keep up with the armor ahead. The Soviet Union's vast summer landscape, its beauty and its scale, was about to become the largest battlefield in human history. Within days, Army Group Center had encircled over 290,000 Soviet soldiers in the Białystok-Minsk pocket in the first 10 days. German encirclement tactics, the Kesselschlacht, trapped entire Soviet armies in pockets that were then systematically destroyed. Army Group South drove toward Ukraine, the breadbasket of the Soviet Union, and the territorial prize at the heart of Hitler's ideology. German reconnaissance units raced ahead of the main advance, appearing in Soviet towns before anyone had told the inhabitants the war had arrived. German panzer commanders operated at a pace and depth that Soviet command structures could not track or counter. The initiative was total. Army Group North drove through the Baltic states toward Leningrad, 700 kilometers of advance in 6 weeks of summer fighting. Soviet civilians watched German columns enter their cities, uncertain, afraid, and unable to imagine what occupation would actually mean for them. The Battle of Smolensk trapped another 300,000 Soviet soldiers, but the 2-month battle consumed time that Germany could not afford to lose. Soviet political commissars struggled to explain the catastrophe in ideological terms. The Red Army was not failing from lack of will, but from lack of time to adapt. By late summer, Germany had taken over 3 million Soviet prisoners, a military catastrophe without parallel in modern warfare. German POW policy treated Soviet prisoners as subhuman. Over 3 million would die in German captivity by the end of 1941. German engineers examining captured T-34 tanks were alarmed. The Soviet tank was in many respects superior to anything Germany possessed. Soviet heavy tanks like the KV-1 were impervious to standard German anti-tank guns, forcing German commanders to improvise solutions on the fly. Soviet soldiers fought back with enormous courage from the first day. Even as their command structure collapsed around them, they attacked.
This country, it does not have an end.
We are still so far from the horizon.
German supply lines stretched to their breaking point. Fuel shortages were already slowing panzer divisions that had been designed to never stop. Soviet geography proved as formidable an obstacle as Soviet resistance. The Pripyat marshes alone split the German advance and complicated coordination. The Kiev encirclement captured 665,000 Soviet soldiers, the largest in military history, but the time it cost Germany would prove fatal. German soldiers had been fighting continuously for 2 months. The physical and psychological cost was visible in every face. Stalin ordered 1,520 factories moved east of the Urals, the greatest industrial relocation in history, and the decision that would ultimately win the war. Soviet factories behind the Urals began producing T-34 tanks at a rate that German planners had calculated was impossible. Moscow's citizens dug anti-tank ditches with their bare hands, hundreds of thousands of civilians mobilizing to defend their city. Millions of Soviet civilians moved east, carrying with them the skills, tools, and determination to rebuild beyond the reach of the German advance. Soviet communications were being destroyed faster than they could be rebuilt. Commanders issued orders to armies that no longer existed. Stalin's response to military failure was to shoot his generals, executing dozens for cowardice in a catastrophe that his own decisions had created. Autumn rains turned Soviet roads to bottomless mud. German vehicles designed for European roads were consumed by the Rasputitsa, the Russian mud season. Soviet partisans began attacking German supply lines, opening a second war in the occupied rear that would never end until 1945. The Katyusha rocket launcher appeared on the Eastern Front, its salvos devastating German positions and demoralizing troops who had never experienced anything like it. German logistics were consuming themselves to 600,000 horses needed feeding. Fuel was running short, and the supply lines stretched further every day. In destroyed villages across the occupied territories, Soviet civilians gathered in whatever still stood. The occupation had taken everything except their presence on the land. Behind German lines, SS Einsatzgruppen began systematically murdering Jewish civilians. Barbarossa was also the beginning of the Holocaust. Across Ukraine and Belarus, Jewish communities were being annihilated, an entire civilization destroyed behind the front lines. German occupation imposed terror on Soviet civilians. Survival required calculations no civilian should ever face. Soviet partisans organized in the forests. By 1942, hundreds of thousands tied down entire German divisions. German soldiers writing home in autumn 1941 chose their words carefully. The campaign was not over, and temperatures were falling. Army Group North reached Leningrad in September, but the city refused to fall, beginning an 872-day siege. Over 1 million Leningraders would die of cold and starvation, but the city would never surrender. Operation Typhoon, the drive for Moscow, began in October as temperatures began their long fall. In mid-October, Moscow briefly panicked before Stalin decided to remain in the Kremlin. Stalin's decision to remain in Moscow steadied Soviet resistance at its most critical moment. Soviet troops marched across Red Square on November 7th and straight to the front, telling the world Moscow would not fall. German soldiers could see Moscow's church domes through binoculars, but fresh, Siberian divisions and merciless cold blocked their path. Frostbite casualties exceeded combat losses. Weapons froze solid in temperatures the army had never prepared for. By December 5th, the German advance had stopped, exhausted and frozen, 15 kilometers from Moscow's center. Zhukov's counteroffensive struck on December 5th, fresh Siberian. divisions hitting an army that had been fighting for 6 months without rest. German forces fell back from Moscow, the first German retreat of the war and the end of Barbarossa's dream. German soldiers held their winter positions with improvised equipment, an army that came for summer learning to survive the Eastern Front's first winter. Barbarossa had failed. The war Germany wanted to last 8 weeks would last 4 years. Occupied Soviet cities were systematically stripped, economic exploitation matching military violence in scale and deliberateness. At Babi Yar, 33,771 Jewish men, women, and children were murdered in 2 days, one of the Holocaust's largest single massacres. By end of 1941, 2 million Soviet Poles had died in German captivity of starvation, cold, and deliberate ideological neglect. Soviet women and workers ran the war economy, producing the weapons that would eventually turn the tide. Behind both front lines, the war lived in letters read by candlelight, in faces waiting for news that might never come. The Eastern Front stretched 2,900 kilometers, the largest battlefield in human history, consuming armies without end. The army that conquered France in 6 weeks was now clinging to frozen positions, transformed by the most brutal fighting in history. German commanders in January 1942 faced a hard truth. The war they had planned was not the war they were fighting. The Red Army was rebuilding, incorporating 1941's bitter lessons into a force that would become the most effective ground army in the world. German logistics fell back on horse-drawn sleds, the most modern army in the world, reduced to Napoleonic supply methods. Leningrad's only lifeline was the road of life across frozen Lake Ladoga, trucks crossing 30 kilometers of ice under fire. Leningraders received 125 grams of bread per day, barely enough to survive, yet the city maintained its culture and its will. German prisoners marched through Moscow's streets, Stalin's message that the invincible Wehrmacht could be captured and defeated. Both armies watched each other across the frozen landscape, resting, rebuilding, preparing for the war spring would resume. By December 1941, Barbarossa's first 6 months had produced casualties exceeding any comparable period in the history of warfare. Spring brought the mud season, immobilizing both armies before the 1942 campaign could begin. In 1942, Germany launched Case Blue, driving toward the Caucasus oil fields and a city on the Volga whose name would become synonymous with catastrophe. By 1942, Soviet industrial output was surpassing Germany's, factories east of the Urals producing weapons faster than the front could consume them. Soviet cities became battlegrounds, fought street by street, building by building, in the ruins of a civilization consumed from within. 2 armies converged on the Volga, on a city whose name would become the turning point of the Second World War. The German line stretched impossibly thin towards Stalingrad, the overextension visible on any honest map as the precondition for catastrophe. Thin Romanian and Hungarian forces held the Stalingrad flanks, the weakness Soviet planners were already preparing to exploit. The full arc of Barbarossa mapped clearly: the summer of conquest, the autumn slowdown, the winter halt, and 3 objectives never reached. Over 800,000 German soldiers died in Barbarossa's first 6 months, buried in the country they came to conquer. Soviet soldiers liberating occupied villages found what German occupation meant, and the fury it generated would drive them all the way to Berlin. The Soviet winter counteroffensive proved German forces could be pushed back. The psychological significance of this fact could not be overstated. The German soldier who entered the Soviet Union in June 1941 was not the same man who held the winter line in December. The Eastern Front transformed everyone it touched. The Soviet Union's greatest asset was its depth. Germany destroyed everything it could reach, and could not reach enough to matter. Moscow's lights burned through December 1941. The capital had not fallen, and its survival meant the Soviet Union would survive. 30 million Soviet civilians lived under German occupation. governed by a racial ideology that determined who would eat and who would die. 10 months after the invasion, the strategic reality was clear. The war could no longer be won, only prolonged. Soviet industrial output surpassed German production by 1942, the Eastern Front's outcome being written in factories as much as on battlefields. Barbarossa's failure created Germany's global encirclement, at war simultaneously with the Soviet Union, Britain, and the United States. The guns would fire for 3.5 more years, but the question of who would win had been answered in the winter of 1941. From Siberia to Ukraine, every nationality of the Soviet Union, these were the faces of those who would ultimately prevail. The road from Barbarossa's failure led directly to Stalingrad, where the 6th Army's encirclement would begin Germany's long final retreat. Soviet communities began building memorials before the war even ended, giving names and places to a people who would mourn for generations. The road east carried the evidence of what had passed: 3 million soldiers and the ambition of an empire that underestimated the world it invaded. The complete map of Barbarossa told its own story, the largest invasion in history, which achieved everything except what it set out to achieve. The Soviet Union was too vast, too deep, and too determined, geography inhuman, while defeating the greatest military force of its era. In villages across the liberated Soviet Union, life continued, a people refusing to be defined by what had been done to them. The birch forests outlasted the greatest invasion in history, silent witnesses to what ambition, ideology, and underestimation cost the world.